Okay, so today we're going to talk about pensions. And while it may seem to be a dry topic, it's an extremely important topic because as a first responder, as a public servant, one of the most significant benefits that you have is your pension. And so in studio today we have Tom Wicke. He's a lawyer with Lewis Marenstein. They're out in the valley here in Los Angeles, who's been doing pensions for decades. And if ever I have a pension question, I call or message Tom. In fact, I've probably communicated with Tom on 50 to 100 different cases when it comes down to we're settling a case or they want somebody to pension off. So this is the resource I use, which is why I've invited him to come into studio, and he has graciously agreed. And just so that you can understand some of the topics we're going to cover today, we'd actually do a little preparation. Talking about pensions versus 401ks and who pays into the pension and how do you get your pension and what happens if you get hurt on the job and how does that interrelate with accommodations. And then what about special programs that the LAPD has, for example, like DROP, Deferred Retirement Option Plan, I believe it is. It's been around forever. Well, I guess not forever, since, what was the mayor's name?
Reardon.
Reardon, thank you. But we're going to talk about all these things with Tom and his experience, and hopefully you come away from this with some understanding of one of the biggest benefits you have. So Tom, why don't you just introduce yourself and tell us about your experience with pensions.
Thank you. Well, great to be here. I'm glad you invited me because you and I have talked so many times on the phone and in person and at cases that we've exchanged information, but it's usually an individual case, of course. But we spent a lot of time talking about process and procedure, how a pension case fits into your cases and vice versa. But my background is such that I've been practicing for over 40 years and primarily in the pension arena. We represent in our firm employees that are safety, first responders, and others. We represent them in a variety of pension systems, including the county, the city, CalPERS, which are the primary ones in California that we practice in. The specialty is such that there isn't many people that really practice in pensions. Usually it's an offshoot of a workers' compensation case where a person's injured and can't go back to work. And we get all kinds of cases from different sources with that. But I've had lots of cases that I've litigated to the point that I'm proud to tell you that I have actually 9 published decisions in this area. And being a lawyer, getting a published decision, just one is difficult.
Correct. Nine's a lot.
Is a lot. So the idea is we're on the edge of things, trying to create things for injured workers to get them the benefits.
And one of the benefits to the listener is when you have published cases. Of course, my dad's a lawyer. We were talking about that. He's 89 this year. He's retired. And so I know the significance of published decisions, and 9 is a lot. Now, if you were an appellate lawyer, maybe not, but you're not an appellate lawyer.
No.
So one of the things, and Tom has mentioned that we have worked together, and you might be saying, well, wait a second, I don't understand. Hey, McNicholas, you're an employment lawyer, discrimination, retaliation. He's a pension lawyer. How does that work? And the way it works is when a case comes to me, if it's a whistleblower case or a retaliation case or discrimination case, and we're getting down to try and resolve the case, and the entity says, hey, your officer, your firefighter, she's got to go. Well, that implicates a pension. And so I've often been on the phone with Tom dozens and dozens of times from mediations, figuring out years of service and how you can buy it back. So that's how our 2 areas of practice fit together. And he is right. I've had hundreds and hundreds of conversations with him. So let's just start at the very beginning. What is the basic difference between a pension and a 401k?
Well, that's a good question. Like you and I have a 401k because we're in a private industry and we want to save for money for our pension, so we set up a pension plan through where we work. But a defined benefit plan, which is the public employees that we both represent, is a system where the employer and the employee put money into a system, and that's your pension. And that is a defined benefit plan. Definition is just that simple. When you reach a certain age or a certain length of service combined, your benefit is defined. Whereas in a 401k, there is no definition of what your benefit is. It can go up or down depending upon your investments.
So by defined, you mean that if you vest and you get to 85%, you get 85% of a certain annual salary until you die, yes?
That's correct.
And a 401k, you could have $1 million in Bitcoin and it could get flushed down the toilet and you could have nothing.
Zero.
Right.
Right.
So let me ask a question there. You said that the agency makes contributions, yes?
True.
Okay. So what happens, and I remember 2008, and I remember what was the whole thing about Wall Street, something about protesting.
It was a real estate crash at
Right.
that point.
But
The mortgages.
people were protesting Wall Street. I remember in front of City Hall, right? People were in encampments,
Yeah.
right? But there was a huge issue then about tax revenues had plummeted, right? And so there were discussions about would the government entity be able to make its contributions because it's a defined plan, right? They
Correct.
have to put money in. And if the market takes a dive, they have to put more money in.
That's
so
right.
talk to the listener. So they're thinking, okay, Tom, I'm just sworn, I've only got 2 years on. Is this thing still going to be here in 25 or 30 years when I need to retire?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the pension systems that we deal with, they have survived for decades and decades, and they've been around. But that's interesting because when you were hired as an employee and you're in your 20s, you had a couple of years in the job, the last thing you're thinking about is retiring. It's too far away. I mean, you're raising family, you got kids in school, and there's other things that are much more important. So you got this pension plan where you've been putting money in, but as you get older, kind of the gray hair, so to speak, makes you wiser, and you see actually the importance of the pension because it's going to be your income for the rest of your life or your spouse's life, for example. So the point is that pensions initially in the work environment is not significant, but it becomes extremely significant down the road because it's your financial survival. Because you can't really rely upon Social Security, for example, to survive on a daily basis.
So let me ask a slightly more refined question. In your decades of experience, have you heard or seen conversations by, say, elected officials where the idea of possibly pulling back on pension commitments vis-a-vis retirement plans? So say, look, we'll do a pension at a lower level, but we're going to make the employee augment it with a 401k so that we, the government entity, aren't on the hook for so much. Have you been a part or heard of those conversations over your experience?
Yes, and actually it occurred in this state, both with CalPERS, California Public Employees Retirement System, and STRS, State Teacher Retirement System. When Jerry Brown was our governor.
Which time?
The second time.
Okay.
Yeah, he was older than 30. And he started looking at the money parts of those systems and realized that a defined benefit plan, because the benefit's defined at a certain percentage of your pay, you must continue to put money into the system. And what happens is that sometimes the fund becomes underfunded. They can't meet all their obligations by statute. So how do you fix that? And the way they did this, both in CalPERS and it's called the PEPRA Act, which was passed in 2014, which basically refined the whole system. But the primary thing is they changed the tables. So the guy that you mentioned earlier, who's at 80% of his pay, for example, now when they're hired as a new employee, they have a different plan, a pension plan, and they're putting more money in, and the state of California is putting less in at that point. So over time, what will happen is that financially the fund will be solvent, so to speak. So the idea of having that occur is always on the minds of the city of Los Angeles, for example, because they have to have so much money that goes into the fund. Because if for some reason the obligation to the fund must be made by the employer, that's the law. If there's a default in some mechanism, they state or city or county has to make that payment. So to the employee, that is, when they're ready to retire.
So let's talk about you're ready to retire. So You and I both practice in the City of Angels, Los Angeles. So this is LAPD and LAFD, LA City Fire. They have their own pension system. Is that right?
That's right. That's because they're not governed by statute. Basically, there's three main systems in the state. CalPERS, which, as you know, is state employees. State teacher retirement, which is all basic teachers in the state. Then there is the county retirement system, which was passed in 1937, which covers counties within the state. Not all of them, but most of them, certainly the larger ones. And lastly is the charter cities. So, for example, LA City is a charter city, so they get to make up their own pension system, which they did. So they're not members of the legislature, don't define what their plan is. So in this case, the city set up a plan, which is very simple. The employees put money in, the employer puts money in, and at a certain age, they end up then drawing their money. Now you're going to say, well, how would they know how much money to put in? If you and I wanted to set up a pension plan, how would we determine that? Well, we got to figure out, like a life insurance policy, the assumptions that you make. So many people are going to quit. So many people are going to get injured. So many people will pass away. So we will hire new employees. And so all these assumptions by actuarial folks make the determination of how much money should be put into the system. And that's an ongoing process that's really required by each system to evaluate each year to figure out how much money is in the system.
So, okay, there's a couple of things in there I want to ask you about. LA County Sheriff, they are CalPERS, is that right?
No, the 37 Act. It's CERL, County Employees Retirement Law.
Okay.
That's all right. It's in the government code. Don't worry about it.
Now, the reason I'm going to jump ahead and then I'm going to come back to this. So if you work for LA County Sheriff and you separate for whatever reason and you go to LAPD, can you take your years of service from LA County Sheriff to LAPD?
Well, that's really a good question. The answer is yes, you can, because they're public employers, and vice versa, LAPD and back to the county. But most of the time, because LAPD is a charter system, they're not as liberal of recognizing other public service. Military, for example. LAPD recognizes military as something you can buy as service credit to enhance your years of service to get the pension. But they don't, the more liberal ones are really the county systems where you can have, for example, leave of absences, you can purchase time. Educational time, you can purchase time, where you're absent from work and then you buy that time. So the point is that generally speaking, you can transfer from one to the other and not have your pension injured or reduced or diminished. And the concept mostly applies to CalPERS cases, state cases, and county cases, because those people change back and forth the whole time. And the concept is reciprocity,
right?
Which means that you get credit for the other employer, their first employer, by you keep the money in that system, and then your new employer has a separate system, but you keep the money in separate systems, then you retire on the same date from both systems, and then you get the benefit of the salary of your new job. So, for example, if I work as a trainee as a deputy sheriff or CHP, and I work there, and then I graduate, I work as a CHP officer for a period of time, maybe 5 years. Then I transfer to the county, become a deputy sheriff. I can keep money in both those systems, and then when I retire, I coordinate those benefits based upon my salary as a county employee, not what I was making at the CHP, for example. Oh. So that's the advantage of reciprocity.
So I've had these conversations with you where, when I'm representing an LAPD officer, that they are unable to port or transfer their years of service to other agencies. So are there any agencies, so LAPD, let's say I'm a Sergeant 1, I have 15 years on the job, and I want to go to Long Beach PD. Will my 15 years transfer over?
It should, yes.
And do I have to pay anything for that?
No. Well, there's a couple of different ways that can be done. Number one, you could go to Long Beach and begin working. You got 15 years in, leave your money in the city of LA. and then you work another 20 years for Long Beach, and you're a different pension system, and you coordinate both of those pensions. So you're getting two checks then, one from the city and one from CalPERS.
Yeah.
Other way to do it is...
Well, hold on. Well, I thought you had to have at least 19 and a half at LAPD to collect a pension.
You mean 19 and a half years of service?
Yes.
Not necessarily, because there's something called a deferred pension, which means you get it later as opposed to right now.
I see.
Okay, so, and in the city system, there's 6 different tiers. Each tier has a different definition. So but the bottom line is that you can draw money from both systems at the same time.
See. So, well, again, what this is highlighting is there's a lot of complexity with pensions. And it's such an important benefit. And if you're a first responder, whether you're a police officer or you're corrections and you're a sheriff's deputy, or you're with the CHP, or you're with Willits PD or LAFD or LA County, how you move will be greatly impacted by what happens to your pension.
Yes, and the thing you need to do is the member, the person who's thinking of the move, has to research this to make sure they know what they're doing. For example, there's no one stopping you from taking your money out of the system when you move.
Ugh.
Okay, you can do that.
Disaster.
Okay, but sometimes you don't do that. So the question is, what is the reasons you're moving, and what are you protecting or not protecting? There's a whole variety of things that can happen. For example, to maximize your pension, you want to do that. Maybe you don't want to maximize your pension. If you're going through a divorce, maybe you want to withdraw the money.
Okay, there's a good question. Boy, yeah. The divorce rate among coppers and firefighters is fairly high. So I hadn't even thought about that until you just said that. So, okay,
Yeah.
So I'm a police officer. I've got 25 years on. So I'm at LAPD. I've got my years on. I'm now, 52 and a half, 53.
Right.
So I can actually get a check. And my wife and I are now going to get a divorce. Okay? Those are my assumptions. I think I have enough assumptions in there, Tom. Is my wife entitled to a certain portion of that pension as community property?
Yes.
And now, that could go both ways. If it's a female officer or firefighter, and they have the same years of service, their male spouse, or I guess same gendered spouse, depending on the system, would be entitled to some portion of it. I won't quantify whether it's half or not half based on community property laws, yes?
Correct.
So let's just talk as a general matter. Now I hear people like picking up their pencils right now at home. How is that addressed? So I'm the police officer and I say, okay, Tom, I don't want to pay half of my pension going forward. I'm 55, I think I'm going to live forever, whatever, and I don't want to pay half of my pension check. What are the avenues by which I can avoid that? You mean like buy her out, things of that nature?
Yeah. First of all, I'm not a specialist in family law, and so you got to take what I say as a grain of salt. But many, many, many of my clients keep their pension, and the way they do that is they trade for the house, because the house is a strong asset as well, just as the pension is. So she keeps the house, you move out, and then you get to keep the pension. That's normally the way it works. But there's other assets, depending upon your financial situation, and other assets you might be able to trade with. But typically, most of my clients try to keep what they have in their pension. And sometimes you can't. You just can't do it. So the trade then is negotiating what percentage she would get and what percentage he would get.
Going back to the old saw, the most important financial decision you ever make is who you marry.
That's right. Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about, I want to switch gears a little bit, and I want to go to medical pensions, injury pensions.
Okay.
So I'm going to start with an example I think I know the answer to. I'm going to keep using me. So I've got 20 years on, right? And I'm off on the weekend at Lake Havasu or Lake Havasu, whatever you want to call it, and I get in some boating accident and, fracture my right shoulder and arm, and I can't really use I can't engage in arrest maneuvers. I can't really use a firearm. And is that injury, would that injury alone allow me to get a medical-based pension?
Yes.
Okay, explain that.
Because there's two types of medical-based pension. One is off the job, one is on the job, typically called IOD pension and non-IOD pension. In this example, what you said, He's vacationing or spending the weekend in Lake Havasu. So it's clearly off the job, right? But as a lawyer, and you know this because you got to talk to your client to find out exactly how the injury occurred. For example, in my career, a person that I know died, police officer, LAPD, in New York while hunting. And in this hunting accident, the question was, how did it occur? And investigating the case, he had passed out from the hunting trip. He was on a tree stand, and they were using bow and arrows looking for deer. So
Okay.
they were sophisticated hunters, right? So what they found him is on the ground, having fallen out of the tree stand and had died. So they said to me, well, what do you think about this case? I said, well, is there anything else going on? And after investigating the case, I found that 2 days before he was in California performing his duties, he was in a traffic accident and got T-boned. And the bottom line is he had an injury, which he really didn't know he had it, although his behavior was different, lethargic, fatigue, etc. And so the bottom line was specifically we were able to tie in the traffic accident because that caused a brain bleed that caused him to pass out 3,000 miles away, and he fell from the tree.
So what you're saying is it's not necessarily the geographical location of the injury where the injury occurs. If it can be medically traced to an injury suffered on the job,
Yes.
you can get a medical pension, which is significant because there's tax implications. Yes?
Correct.
Right. But if I'm a 10-year officer and I'm in perfect health and I've never suffered an on-work injury and I'm out riding dirt bikes and I break my arm, that's not a
Correct.
medical pension, correct?
Correct. Well, it's a medical pension for non-work related. Remember I told you there's those types, which is not, it's taxable income, number one.
Right.
And number two, it isn't a high number typically. Normally it's around a third or so of your pay.
And the tax benefit is significant.
Correct. And let's go through some examples of that.
Okay.
Most of the systems in the county and through CalPERS, the benefit is 50% of your pay is the maximum benefit you can get on a service-connected disability retirement, industrial disability retirement. So now the question becomes, how does the tax work? Well, if you have length of service and age that gives you a normal pension, let's say of 70%, and then you apply for a disability pension, and you're successful, is the entire 70% tax-free? No, because what's the maximum you can get? 50%. So the 50% is tax-free, and the balance in this example with 20% would be taxable. Now, I do have clients that are much more aggressive with the IRS, and they say, no, the whole thing is tax-free. But again, I'm not an expert in tax law. What you really need to do is talk to either a tax expert or your CPA or whoever does that, because they have to justify it, obviously, on the return. So that's different, though, from our friends at LAPD, because at LAPD, when you get a disability pension, there's a chart, and the chart is different from any other system, and based upon the fact you can't do your job as a police officer,
Right.
based upon the fact that it's a work-related injury, the percentage you get is a percentage of your pay, like other systems, but the percentage is based upon the degree of your disability. So if you can't lift 10 pounds or 15 pounds or 20 pounds, each one of those has a different evaluation under their disability rating sheet. Again, it's a hybrid system simply because the city charter allows them to write up these provisions of how a person qualifies for a pension.
So you mentioned a phrase there, which I wrote down. When you go to get a medical pension, you can't do your job. And you're referring to the essential functions, yes?
Yes.
Okay. So we were talking about this before we started, and I have spoken about this issue, and something I'm starting to see, a pattern, and I want to get your thoughts on it, is I've had cases where there's a disability discrimination or some type of retaliation. Several cases had them go to verdict, and upon occasion, they have applied for medical pension. And that, as you know, requires some document that they sign under penalty of perjury, which says, I cannot perform the essential functions of my job, yes?
True.
Okay. So in that circumstance, it makes the accommodation case much more difficult. I won't get into the wonkiness of it, but it's, the job you had or the job you wanted.
Right.
For the accommodation, outside versus inside, that old saw.
Right.
But my question is, the thing that I am seeing is municipalities. So technically, let's use Los Angeles again. While the LAPD has an accommodation policy, which is now Special Order 7, which was drafted by Chief Bratton but held in abeyance and then re-enlivened by, was it not Moore? It was it Beck? No, Moore.
Moore instituted. Bratton passed it.
Right.
And after that, Beck ignored it, and then Moore decided to implement it.
2019. Right. Okay. So, but personnel is municipal-wide, right? It's the city of Los Angeles. And I've started to see this aggressive anti-accommodation policy come into play. And to me, it strikes me, is that it's kind of a defund the police and fire, to some extent, through the back door. And by that I mean, if you're not going to accommodate somebody and you're going to push them off the job, you are shrinking the number of officers and firefighters you have. Yes?
True.
So are you seeing this pattern, as I'm seeing as an employment lawyer, as possibly part of some type of quiet defund movement?
You certainly can make that position and perceive it that way, but Moore, when he instituted, he said, look, we need people in the street. They need to be full duty. If they can't perform that, and I'm not arguing that they can or can't, let's assume they cannot, we need to replace them. That was his whole idea, getting more people in the street. But it really backfired.
Oh, yeah.
Completely backfired, because what ended up happening is people would be injured and they couldn't do their job. And so the people in the street reduced, the numbers of people were tremendously reduced.
Right. In fact, I cross-examined him within the last 12 months of his job in a failure to accommodate case. And I don't know that he saw where this was going, but he testified that the LAPD reached its peak at the point he instituted that policy.
Yeah.
10,200. He was very proud of that number.
Yeah.
And then what he didn't anticipate coming was me writing on the butcher paper what the years were as the policy was implemented, and it was a straight line down.
Yeah.
So, right, what you're saying is, okay, well, we want more people in the street, or we're not going to accommodate you. I guess he thought that would be carrot and the stick and make people get off the roll, right?
Right.
Well, as you and I both know, there was a surge of people who just said, well, I can't do it, I'm leaving.
Yeah.
It was like 800 or 900 officers.
Yeah. What do you mean you're leaving?
Right.
Yeah, I can't do the job. That's what you told me, right? Why should I stay?
Now, on the pension side, did you work with a large number when that started to happen, when people said, look, I can't go back, so I'm out?
Yeah, some, but not as many as I really thought. There was a big fear that there would be hundreds of people then applying for the pension. But what ended up happening is they implemented it kind of on a progression basis. And so people left. They interviewed at Huntington Beach. They interviewed at Long Beach. They got jobs there. Okay, that was one. So it was a big transition.
So those other cities got all of the years of experience we, as the citizens of Los Angeles, paid for.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
And all the training.
Right. All the training. And as you and I know, the experience you get in your first 5 years at LAPD is like a career almost everywhere else.
Correct. Yeah, because it's so intense. Because if you have other cities, like take a deputy sheriff, and you know this, when you're hired, you don't go to the street typically. You go to custody.
Right.
So in custody, you got a whole different perspective on how to handle inmates, how to escort them, how to search them, and so on and so forth. That's a different ballgame than someone who's in the street right out of the box. And when you're a young person wanting to be a police officer, male or female, your goal is to be in the street because you want that contact with people to either arrest them, detain them, whatever, to do the things that are required of you. And so when that happens, you get a quicker experience at LAPD. But at the same time, what ends up happening, those individuals who said they were legitimately injured and couldn't do the job, they ended up leaving simply because they would not accommodate them. So that was really a problem.
So one of the mantras I have touted through our social media feed, because I took up the charge of Special Order 7 because not only did I think it violates the law as a blanket rule that you can accommodate no one, right, at that level, which is completely false.
Yes.
I just thought it violated their employment rights. But part of, or was I saying, one of my mantras is you don't want to have to come to me for a failure to accommodate. So one of the ways is prophylactically do those things to not get to that point. And so you're saying, where are you going with this? Here's where I'm going. Is there a series of injuries that you see more frequently, disabilities, if you will, that cause people to have to pension off? What do you see in your experience?
Yes, I would say generally orthopedic injuries, back and necks. Those things, knees, shoulders are probably secondary, and after that, heart, hypertension. But your back and neck are really taking it. And all you got to do is think about what's the police officer do. They're wearing a Sam Browne, 20 pounds, 25 pounds, 30 pounds, depending on where you're working, what you're doing. A vest, again, added to that. In and out of a vehicle repetitively, not once, not twice, many, many, many times per shift. And that's another thing, like some agencies are working 12-hour shifts now, which is a killer on your body. Oh, I got these 4 days off. It's wonderful. Yeah, but you're recuperating a day or two as well.
And what is that called? What is
Cumulative trauma.
Well, right, but
The Sam Browne.
Sam Browne-itis?
Yeah, Sam Browne presumption.
Right.
In workers' comp, not pensions. It's considered to be presumed to be work-related.
So, okay. So, as I hear the officers, they call it Sam Browne-itis. What's Sam Browne-itis is just an inflammation or irritation, but it's what happens from the Sam Browne.
Right.
So, we have talked about, the vest or the weight distribution vest or shirt. Now, LAPD recently has allowed that with certain officers. Is that
True.
right?
That's right.
How many agencies that you work with, meaning you don't work with the agencies, you work with the officers that work for those agencies, is it a small percentage, a large percentage that are able to use those, whatever you call them, the tactical shirts, vests where you can put the tools on? What are you seeing there?
I've seen a lot more in recent times. It depends on a very simple word, money.
Right.
Whether they have the budget to order those types and use those. But yes, I would say the proactive agencies, the Ventura County, for example, they do a lot of that. So I would say it's a trend that's continuing to grow, where they have a lighter vest and more tools off their waist and on their chest area.
So let's talk about, because I know you then went down to knees, and I understand that's also a function of pounding with all the extra weight, right? An extra 30 pounds, that's a lot. Fortunately, firefighters only have to put their turnouts on, a couple times a day, and when they get all geared up, I think it's like 80 pounds.
Yeah, it is with the BA, right?
Yeah. The which?
The BA, breathing apparatus.
Thank you. They just got new ones, too. I saw a demonstration on those. But, okay, let's go to the hypertension. Are you finding with your clients, when, again, I know this is a narrowed universe, right? Because there's a whole universe of people who have hypertension who don't do anything about it and don't get a pension, and then there's the universe that do something, some come to you and some don't. But the people that come to you, are you seeing any trends with like undiagnosed hypertension, or it was diagnosed years after the onset? Are you seeing anything like that?
Yeah, that's a pretty common circumstance because in the system, a doctor will call hypertension the silent killer.
Right.
Because you don't have pain. You don't feel it. And you think, well, I got a little bit of a headache. Or somebody says, why are you red in the face, Matt? What's your problem? Well, I don't have a problem. What are you talking about? And the point is, it is the hypertension. And typically, it's not controlled. And you go to a doctor because you got a headache, you can't sleep, or stress on the job. They give you medication. You think, oh, I'm cool now. I can take the medication. I'll be fine. But it doesn't really work that way. Because over time, it's the silent killer because it's still there. Even though it goes up and down and fluctuates, but it can have damage to other organs, primarily the heart, when it's not really monitored on a regular basis. The advice on the hypertension I always say is go to your doctor, get worked up on a cardiovascular basis, heart basis, and then follow the directions of your doctor because you don't know oftentimes that's occurring.
So I actually was diagnosed with prehypertension. No shock. Trial lawyer representing cops and firefighters, go figure.
Yeah.
But one day I walked into some CVS, and they had They
Yeah,
have
it
those
was- yeah.
those blood pressure cuffs,
Right.
right? And this is, of course, before the pandemic. And I put my arm in it, and I'm like, oh, that number seems kind of high. And I thought, oh, the machine was broken. And like 6 months later, I tried it somewhere else. It was like at the gym, and I'm like, this is a problem. So I went to my doctor, and one of the things he said, and so this was the free advice I'm giving you. He said, go to your CVS and get an Omron, Omran, blood pressure cuff.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Do it first thing in the morning. And he said, go to the bathroom if that's whatever you do, but don't have your coffee. Sit down, feet flat on the floor, put the cuff, follow it, and record it for 1 week.
Right.
Do it 3 times a day. Do it when you wake up, same time. And I brought it into him, and he said, you have prehypertension, and put me on the medication. And he explained to me, I said, well, okay, so you have higher blood pressure. What's the deal? And he said, what ends up happening is your arteries will fight against it and firm up and harden.
Yeah.
And so that they're no longer elastic. Anyway, this is the prevention that we're talking about. And we are going to have another podcast with an MD, whose name I'm going to get from you, to talk about the orthopedic issues and the hypertension. So give us a third one. I think you had a third one. You said back, knees, hypertension, and was there any?
Shoulders.
Shoulders.
It's pretty common because you're putting on a vest. Typically, firefighters are putting on turnout gear, which is heavy. Putting on the BA, a lot of shoulder injuries occur.
Yeah.
Because usually you can't lift you can't lift your shoulder or your arm above a certain shoulder level. So that's typically what happens.
Okay, so here's our exiting question for you.
Okay.
For your audience.
The answer is yes.
Okay, I'll go to question 2. The question is, tell these coppers, these firefighters, these first responders, 3 things you think they should really know about pensions and years of service and things of that nature based on your 40-plus years of experience.
Well, I think the most significant thing would be very simplistically, know your rights under the plan. Know your age and length of service that would institute your ability to take a pension, number 1. So you got to know the plan. Number 2 would be, don't make the assumption just because you haven't been to a doctor for 3 or 4 years and you're healthy as a horse, you work out every day and you run, that you're healthy. You may not be. Internal injuries happen, as you know, without really notice. So the second advice would be go to a doctor prior to your retirement and get a physical. Not a hearing test, not an eye test, a full physical. Have them get your heart rate up, have them check out other things that you need to be looked at. And the third thing is you need to consult with somebody if there's any abnormalities with that. An attorney, not necessarily myself, other firms do this. But the point is you need to consult what your legal rights are. So those are the 3 things I would say.
Okay, so as we're going to, before we part, look into the camera, repeat your name slowly and the name of your firm.
The name is Thomas Wicke, W-I-C-K-E, of Lewis, Marenstein, Wicke, Sherwin, and Lee. We're in the Valley in Woodland Hills.
Okay, and you might as well just say it. What's the main phone number?
818-703-6000.
And what's your assistant's name?
My assistant name is Megan.
And the reason I ask all this is, and I know they're kind of laughing behind the camera, but when we started this a year ago, the idea was I had so many people that would come into my office and say, I didn't know that, I didn't know that, I didn't know that. And by the time they're the bleeding patient on the table, right? We're in a lawsuit.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to get this information out. And Tom is excellent. If you have any pension questions, what's your sister's name again?
Megan.
Megan. Flood Megan. Tom will get back to you, I promise. I'll tell you what, he's the only person I ever call, and he's the only person I've referred hundreds and hundreds of clients to. So thank you for listening, and I hope this was helpful.
Thank you, Matt.